Tracey Enerson Wood loves discovering amazing women whose stories have been lost to history and bringing them to life for today's readers. Her debut novel, The Engineer's Wife, is a historical fiction novel about the woman who built the Brooklyn Bridge. It is an international and USA Today bestseller, and her newest book, The President's Wife, is centered on Edith Bolling Wilson, the second wife of Woodrow Wilson. Tracey has always had a writing bug, and while working as a registered nurse, started her own interior design company, raised 2 children, and bounced around the world as a military wife. She indulged her passion as a playwright, screenwriter, and novelist. She has authored magazine columns and other nonfiction, written and directed plays of all lengths, including Grits, Fleas and Carrots, Rocks and Other Hard Places, Alone, and Fog. Her screenplays include Strike 3 and Roebling's Bridge. And other passions include food and cooking and honoring military heroes. As a New Jersey native, she now lives with her family in Florida. And Tracey will be joined today in conversation with a local author, Jessica Hatch. So interviewer Jessica Hatch has a passion for writing laugh-out-loud fiction with a strong beating heart. Her first novel, My Big Fake Wedding, debuted at #1 on Amazon's Humorous American Literature charts in August 2022, and it went on to be a Lonely Victory's best book of 2022. And her follow-up, How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days, was a book lover pickup for spring 2023. She's been published in Writer's Digest, The Millions, and G-Bob magazine, among others, and she is a proud alumni of the Moors to a Vita Mia workshop in Cesare Romano, Italy. Before being acquired by Bookouture, her debut novel won a pitch slam at the Brooklyn Book Festival in 2018 and was workshopped by acclaimed author Rahman Alam at Aspen Summer Worlds in 2019. Jessica was born outside of Richmond, Virginia, but she now lives here in Jacksonville, Florida, with her bartender husband Paul and their 3 cats. When she's not writing, you can find her jogging on the Riverwalk or planning her next international trip goals. But Jessica, I'll leave the rest to you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. She's so awesome. We've worked together on a couple of these at this point, and she's such a good MC. Tracey, I'm so excited to get to chat with you. First off, happy Publication Day. The President's Wife is hot off the presses today.
Thank you. Thank you. Very happy, very excited.
Yes, and I'm so excited to talk with you. I've chatted with some other historical novelists for this series, and I love always getting into the process of historical fiction. One thing I don't know about you guys, but that draws me to the genre is how I can feel like I'm right there in a moment that I could never access otherwise. And we're going to get into how you make that magic happen. But let me just kind of start things off with a softball. What was your favorite thing about writing The President's Wife? What about Edith Wilson's story just really grabbed you and said, hey, you need to write about this lady? Because last thing I'll say, honestly, this is the first novel about Edith Wilson that had come across my radar.
Yes, thank you for that question. And actually, it wasn't Edith that drew me to the story, believe it or not, even though I am a writer of women's fiction, specifically women's historical fiction, and that's what I look for, you know, that amazing woman that we don't know about that we really need to discover. But I actually discovered something about Woodrow Wilson that I did not know, had no idea. And I just sort of came across this book, a nonfiction book, called President in Love. I'm like, okay, sounds a little interesting. I'm, you know, in a library, crack it open, and it's a bunch of letters. And it is a collection of letters that Woodrow Wilson wrote to his betrothed, Edith, during their courtship in 1915. And I had this image in my head of Woodrow Wilson. You probably have the very same image, a very sort of a stern character, very professorial, because he was, after all, a professor. And then the president of Princeton University, was called something else back then, and then, of course, governor of New Jersey, and then president. And I just had this image in my mind of this stern guy with the pince-nez glasses and barely ever cracked a smile in any of his pictures. Found out later it's because he had bad teeth. But anyway, so I started looking at this book, and these letters were the most incredibly romantic letters I had ever read. And I can't say I'm a huge romance reader, I'm not, but you know, I know what it is and recognize it when I see it. But it wasn't that. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't like a sexy kind of thing. It was just beautifully, beautifully written romantic thoughts, and just so eloquent. And I said, I need to know more about this relationship. And I knew a little bit about Edith, how she was basically famous for taking over the presidency. And like, how exactly did we get there? And then I started going down the road of Edith's history and how she grew up in the post-Civil War South in a family that had been plantation owners and slave owners, and their whole world came crumbling down during the Civil War, which really, really affected her view on life and who she was, and led to a lot of decisions and things that happened later. So it was really the combination of discovering his story and her story and just wanting to see how that merged with what happened in history that I wanted to explore. So,
wow. Yeah, I know what you mean about Woodrow Wilson. I always picture his impeccably starched collar, that presidential portrait of him. That's what always comes to mind when I think of Woodrow Wilson. And the New Jersey versus the South, that's a marriage of differences. We were just talking privately about Houses Divided. That's like bringing together differences and going, how do we make this work?
I have a little joke about that.
Please, go for it.
Not a ha-ha joke, but I like it. So I'm from New Jersey. I actually, born and raised in New Jersey, have lived in the South most of my adult life. And, there are cultural differences, and there are for sure accent differences, right? And I heard a short recording. There are a few existing recordings of Woodrow Wilson speaking. And as you imagine, he's very professorial in diction and very, very, almost a Boston kind of a, that was in Boston, but definitely not a Southern accent whatsoever. He was born in Stanton, Virginia. I mean, that is definitely Virginia dialect kind of talk. So he wasn't born and raised with that accent. So I like to say that when he went and became governor of New Jersey, it was against the law for him to speak with that Southern accent. So in order to comply with New Jersey law, he had to lose it.
He had it coached out of him.
Yeah.
How do you get in the headspace of a historic figure like a president? Usually I think about film, I think about books where a president is a character, and they're kind of a shadowy figure, kind of out of focus in the frame. But in this novel, it countenances more private moments, him in love after widowing his first wife and in ill health after the stroke that ultimately took his life. How do you get in such a vulnerable headspace for someone who was a world figure like that?
Well, a lot of that comes from research. And the first thing you want to do is research the era. What were the headlines of the day? If I can get my hands on an actual newspaper, which you can, magazines and stuff of the time, what was being advertised, what were the real hot button issues? Because we're looking back on it, and what we think were the hot button things and the important things to people are not necessarily what was at the time. And products are different and that kind of thing. So it's really a matter of learning the era and what really was going on in their lives at the time as sort of their background to understand where they were. And then the second most important thing I would say is letters. Woodrow Wilson was an avid letter writer. Edith, too, not quite as much as Woodrow, but you learn a lot from personal letters. And then I would say the third thing is biographies that were written. There are a number of wonderful biographies especially about Woodrow, of course, as a president, but there are very few that are written by people who were within their inner circle. One of them being Dr. Carrie Grayson, who was very much in their inner circle. And if you read those, you really, really find out what was going on, and you'll learn things that you didn't know otherwise. And patching together all those things, the environment, the culture they're living in, what they thought about what things are going on, and what their inner circle said what's going on, and they don't always agree.
Following up on that, did any surprises crop up as you researched this? You spoke a little bit about the love letters and how that kicked off this whole inspiration. But what surprises, if any, cropped up while you were researching?
Yeah, lots of surprises. The first, as you said, was the love letters, the romance, the very intense, very quick romance. And Another surprise was Edith wasn't all in, for quite a while. Woodrow was all in. It was basically sort of a setup that they met each other because he was a very despondent widower, and they basically set him up with a woman because he wasn't functioning without one. So that was kind of surprised to find out that he was set up because he needed a woman, and that Edith was a very happy widow herself and was running her own business. Actually, had now passed it on. People were running it. Was fairly well off, visiting Europe. So she was having a good time. That politics was not her thing. It was actually specifically not her thing. So that was a surprise. But possibly the biggest surprise was what I knew about the history of what Edith did was pretty much he had a stroke and some people accused her of acting as a president, which basically is true. But the big surprise was that didn't start in October of 1919 when he had the major stroke. He was pretty much failing slowly throughout his second term. And from the moment they got married, he pulled her in and she acted as the top advisor for him for the president as the first lady. Very little known fact, I didn't know it, but that was how Woodrow Wilson worked. He didn't trust or share anything with the vice president. It still kind of isn't done. You have vice presidents for different reasons. He didn't trust his own cabinet that he appointed. He didn't share things. He didn't go to them with advice. He trusted his own personal secretary, his physician, and his wife. And those were the people that he trusted. So he had Edith writing and responding to top secret messages throughout his presidency, and including during the war. She had learned to encrypt and de-encrypt secret code. And so it wasn't a matter of, in October 1919, she just started doing this thing. She was doing it throughout his presidency, the most important advisor he had. And that was a big surprise to me.
Honestly, what it reminded me of, because as I said, admittedly, I don't know very much before I read this novel about the Wilson presidency, or much less about Edith Wilson. What it reminded me of is what I know about Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR's presidencies. He had 4 terms, but anyway, I think it's so interesting the portrayals we have of these women who, for whatever reason, end up having higher government security clearance than they should have, are helping their husbands. Edith Wilson, it seems a bit like she was painted as a shrew. Eleanor Roosevelt was often kind of decried as butch, not very attractive, like all of these things. And then you compare that with, those two powerhouses around these 2 war eras. By the time we're in the 1960s, we have the first televised tour of the White House with Jackie Kennedy showing us through the newly renovated White House. So I was wondering if you have any feelings about these shifts and what the First Lady's duties are. Do you feel that it's informed by the era in which a particular First Lady occupies the role?
Well, that's a great question. I think that's part of it. I think the First Ladies are responding to changing women's roles and acting in accordance with how they were changing. But in other ways, I think they are the change makers. They sort of, when they come in, they're not in office, but when they come into the position, they have choices they can make, and they can stay behind the scenes or they can be out there and up front. And I think that's a lot where personality comes into play. Eleanor Roosevelt was a brilliant woman who was really good at those connections. Another thing I learned actually in research, even though it happened after my book ends, was that Eleanor Roosevelt continued to advise presidents long after her husband's death. She went to the White House many times and advised all the presidents basically through her lifetime, and she did that. Edith also, not so much with the presidents, which is probably a good thing considering, but she met with all of the new First Ladies coming in and had them to tea in her home because they retired in Washington, D.C., and she lived long after Woodrow was gone. And she took it upon herself to help sort of educate these women coming in to the role and explaining, this is what I did and you get to do what you want to do. So I think it's a combination of both those things.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. The fact that it's also personality. It's not necessarily just the time you're in, but individual agency. That these women, you know, regardless of how restrained women's rights were at the time, like their personality allowed them to do what they were comfortable
Think
with.
of Jackie Kennedy. I mean, she was a fashionista. She had beautiful, amazing style. She was not one to go out and do speeches and try to inform policy. Not at all. It wasn't who she was. But she did, you know, who she was, and I think magnificently.
Absolutely. I mean, she's still a style icon to some extent. So
I want a pillbox hat myself.
I promise just one more historical question, and then I'll get to, you know, I really enjoy asking nitty-gritty writing questions, so we might get into that.
Careful what you ask. If I don't know the answer, I'll just make it up.
Exactly.
You know,
We'll
I'm a novelist.
flim-flam a little bit up here. But I wanted to talk, you know, just spoke about eras in which first ladies are taking on that role, and even in Edith Wilson's life, you know, she's born in the 19th century. If I'm correct, she passes away in the early 60s. There's a lot of world events that happen in that span of time. And I was just wondering, how did you work to weave these changes, these not micro but macrocosmic changes, into the novel so masterfully? I feel like, you know, because there is, I'm not giving anything away, but there's like chapters that take place in certain time periods that aren't like in the midst of World War I. So, and the tone feels different. So how did you work to weave that tone of whatever is going on in the zeitgeist into The President's Wife?
Again, that goes back to research and understanding the culture, the history of what's going on, and trying to imagine it in their eyes. One of the most difficult thing to do, I think, for me as a historical novelist, is to see the world in the current eyes of the time. It's way different looking back, you know, the old saying, hindsight is 20/20. And, you know, when they were fighting the Great War, they wanted to avoid another war, but there hadn't been another war, you know, another world war. So their look at it was very different. And so in order to get inside my character's head, again, it goes back to the research. What were women wearing? That's always a good clue. You know, if they're wearing corsets and big skirts with hoops, so, you know, they couldn't get on a tram car or ride a horse or, you know, do much except wander down the street, that's impactful to their lives. So it's fashion, it's history, it's geography, and putting all these things together along with the written record, and then just trying to imagine, you know, put your emotional, you know, I'm not, you know, a real young woman anymore, just slightly young. But I've been through a lot of experiences, and I was a nurse and a military wife, and I think all that experience really helps me because I've felt so much, and I've been through so much, and what I haven't felt and been through, I've helped other people through. So all those experiences, being a human, help me to get into my characters' heads, which, by the way, is really important to me. So I'm glad you felt like that.
Yes, absolutely. Both tonally from the narrator perspective and then tonally from the characters. So well done on that. And just to your point about, I love you've brought it up a couple of times now, looking at newspapers, if you can get your hands on microfiche or some sort of archive or anything like that. Even the internet can be great for that sometimes. Sometimes someone will have scanned a piece of media from a time. It's interesting to think about the moment in which we're living in a historical lens, because it's like there are the things that feel so important to 2023. But when you reduce this year down to just like the major headlines, it's just like, what will be written about in history books then? Or even just like you look at the bestseller lists in 1921 and half those books you wouldn't know, you know? It's just fascinating to me in that regard. But you mentioned your background in nursing and being a military wife and also a military mom at this point. And I would love for you to speak more about how you feel that helps you write your books. Is there anything, you spoke about human experience, and I'm sure as a nurse you've met a lot of human experience in addition to your firsthand experience. So can you talk a bit more about how that informs character and character development?
Wow. Okay. Well,
Sorry, we're not doing shallow questions.
She said she started with a softball. She wasn't kidding, right? She went right. Actually, I've always thought this about anybody else in nursing in here? Okay, there's always at least one of us. Nursing is an amazing profession. It's quite difficult. It can be quite stressful. It's also possibly one of the most rewarding professions you can be in. But one of the things I discovered about nursing is it's a really well-rounded career. It helps you to become a well-rounded person because it is so physical. It is also emotional. It is also psychological. It is intellectual. You have to use like every bit of my now worn out brain in order to do it. And so you learn so much, and you learn so much about humanity. And we know how we think, but nurses learn how other people think and how other people react to things that may be, very different than you would react. And similarly, as a military wife, kind of bounced a lot around the world. Didn't get to go real exotic places, but I lived in foreign countries in Europe and kind of all over the country. And it was a great education for hearing those accents, eating the different food, learning the different things that were important in the regions. And it's really a fascinating country if you get out there and you talk to the people, the real people, not the people on the TV with their perfect hair and perfect teeth. That doesn't interest me. It's, go to I discovered Parlor Donuts this week. I'm like, oh my gosh. All right, secret, I've been there 3 times in 3 days. But it's just discovering those things, and now I found that's actually a chain. But it started somewhere. It actually started in Indiana, I found. But just going and talking to those people, which as a military spouse, you're pretty much forced to. You're thrown into a new situation every 2.3 years in the Army. Navy's a little lazier. It's about 4.6 for them. We have a Navy wife here. We wrote a book together, so I'm allowed to tease her. So you learn a lot, you're thrown into new situations, and I actually grew up in a small town and went to the same school and with the same kids, one school classroom, and didn't really have to reach out and meet people, and I didn't know any different. And I had a large family, and it was family in neighborhood in my class, and then I was thrown into this world where, if you're not out there, and I love to talk, might have noticed that, but you don't have your people around you. You've got to go out there, and sometimes it's forced on you. You find that your house isn't working, and take that quite literally. There's all kinds of things happen, and you have to learn to survive because guess what? The spousal unit is off in whatever stand, and you have to be very independent. So both nursing and military wife, I think, really were very valuable to me in writing books.
I have to imagine that the process of being as adaptable as you have to be a military spouse helped inform Edith's psychology in this book, going from having one life and having widowed one husband and being fine with being a widow to being the First Lady of the United States and going on those press tours and code breaking and there's a great scene where she's, I think, at Buckingham Palace and staggered by the opulence, and then the very next day is in a crofter's hall, which is basically the mayor's house in some smaller hamlet of England. Just one day we're at the top, the next day it's, are we wearing dresses to dinner or gowns? And the mayor's wife is like, wear what you have on, it's fine. It just seems like being adaptable is a huge part of her character as well.
And you think how valuable her background of kind of growing up not in poverty so much, because her father had a good income, but they had about 20 to 25 family members coming and living with them at any given time. So they were always stretched, they were always struggling. She had heard from her parents and grandparents how difficult the time was during the Civil War and Reconstruction. So she knew hardship, and she also knew the other side of it. She turned around her first husband's jewelry store into a very successful business in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue. And, so she'd seen both sides. So I think when she was thrown into things like, that's a great example right there. She was meeting with the Queen one day, and that's taken from history. I didn't even make that up. She met with the Queen, and then there's the Royal Guard with the poofy hats and the red jackets and everything, and she, and there's pictures of her just magnificent. She was always dressed to the hilt. And then pretty much the next day, I think maybe it was in Scotland, they went off to a small town, and the mayor's wife was like her host, and they were supposed to go do some things in public. And she's like, oh, okay, which gown should I wear? And the poor mayor's wife, who had basically, because they had only become mayor like the week before, and he was a farmer, and he just got elected to mayor, and they're like sort of adjusting, if you know what I mean. And so she had basically the dress she was wearing, and that was the dress she was wearing. And so, and I learned about that in history, that actually happened. So of course, you got something like that, you got to make a fun scene with it, right? But she was so adaptable because she'd seen it all.
Yeah, we all have to adapt, I suppose. That poor farmer's wife turned mayor's wife. So I noticed, in addition to your two novels back there, Homefront Cooking, what is the delicious thing on the front cover? Because it was like an American flag, like cake or trifle or something. It looks amazing. Mm-hmm. There it is.
It's a coconut cake, and the recipe for coconut cake is in the book, but the flag is made with blueberries, and you can either use strawberries or raspberries. I think they use strawberries for the cover picture, but great for 4th of July, Memorial Day, all good times to use that book, which I'm very proud of, by the way.
Is that the one that you and the Navy wife back there wrote together?
Yep. Our Navy wife back there is Beth Riffle. Beth Riffle and I share, I'm going to say 8 grandchildren. 4 are biological and 4 I loaned to her. So from my other kid, but our kids are married. We have grandkids together, and now we're travel and get in trouble partners. But we co-authored this book, and if we have time, I'll let you know why I did this. So what I realized was that we were losing a lot of stories, family stories. And of course, I'm a big supporter of veterans. My father was a veteran, my husband's a veteran, my son is a veteran, my son-in-law is active duty, very much surrounded with it. And I knew that we had a lot of sort of family stories, we would sit around the dinner table and tell these stories, some of them over and over again, if they're funny enough. And I figured, all families have these wonderful stories, and military folks tend to have some very colorful stories of some very difficult times, exotic times. And I thought, I was thinking how we're losing, our World War II veterans are nearly gone at this time. We're losing Vietnam veterans, Korean War, Vietnam, and now we're even losing our Persian Gulf veterans. And I started to think, these wonderful stories that the family gathers around and listens to are getting lost, And I said, someone for sure is collecting these stories, but I don't know, no one ever asked me for my many stories. So I decided to just go start collecting stories from veterans of different eras. And what was important to me was sort of a tie-in with food, because in my mind, food is what holds families together. Food holds a culture together. So what I wanted was kind of, what was the story you told around the dinner table when you came back from a deployment? What was the food that kept you together? And so I started asking for these stories so I could collect them. And I have to tell you, it's a really, really amazing collection. There's one story goes back to Civil War era with a story that had been told through the generations about, and there's actually a photograph of the little amulets that are in the story, and a beautiful family recipe that was handed down when they told this story. There's several amazing stories from World War II, mostly about how the families were coping. That was really, again, that was sort of the start in me, because this came out before my novels, of looking at what was the women's role in all these historical times. So that's why a lot of the stories are written by spouses of military. So I'm very, very proud of it. And Beth Riffle is also here, and we'll both sign it if you choose to buy it. And we donate all authors' profits to veterans organizations. It was not a money-making thing. We put that money back to veterans. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And even though I write contemporary fiction, you write historical fiction, I think the Venn diagram of us is that food is what brings people together. My second novel is set around this premise of like progressive dinner parties, a group of friends having these dinners that hop from apartment to apartment and almost coming back like the big chill, like after a time apart, you know. Food makes the world go around. Yeah, and also just, I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but, you know, I think any family should sit down and at least, like, get grandma and grandpa to tell their stories, you know, consent to being recorded, because those are always so special. We have a couple of things like that in my family, and, you know, once they're gone, it's really nice to have that record. And how cool with the foundation money. That's really awesome. Can I ask, if it's okay to ask, all right, 2 novels out, a cookbook, what are you working on now? Are you resting? Are you resting on your laurels for like one day, or is there something else you're already working on? Can we get a hint?
If I did that, I'd be in jail, just, you know,
Straight to jail.
Just straight to jail. I am. I actually have a new protagonist I'm working with. And I'm very excited about this book, which will come out probably next year. I can only give you a working title because publishers do what publishers are going to do, and they may change it. But I am writing the story of Catherine Wright. Anybody here know who Catherine Wright is? Huh? No? Okay. Has anybody here ever heard of Orville or Wilbur Wright?
Yeah. Now we're getting somewhere.
Now we're getting somewhere. All right. What I'm going to tell you is, if it weren't for Catherine Wright, you would have never heard of Orville and Wilbur Wright. The airplane would not have been invented when it would probably not have been successful before World War I, where it helped us win that war. I mean, that war was very close, and that was one of the edges we had. Well, if it weren't for Catherine Wright, who supported the Wright brothers in many ways, she ran the bicycle shop when she wasn't at teaching school so that they can go off and do their experiments. They were not rich people. They were not wealthy at all. They were, you know, paycheck to paycheck workers. And so she kept the family solvent and fed while they did their experiments. She also, according to the brothers, offered a lot of the ideas, just kind of the overall, like she's looking at it a big picture where sometimes they're down in the nuts and bolts, and help them solve some of the big things that were going on. Aviation, you know, this was the birth time of aviation, and which also interested me because I have a number of aviators in my family, and okay, I had to learn how to build a bridge. I had to learn about Washington, D.C. politics. I had to learn about being a nurse in World War I, and now I have to learn how to fly a plane and build a plane and invent a plane. Yeah. So it was really fascinating research to me. Also, a slight benefit here, the Wright family was from Dayton, Ohio, which is my husband's hometown, and I know a lot about Dayton, Ohio. And it was really fun to sort of, you know, put some of those things I know about Dayton, Ohio, which is a very, actually, kind of interesting city, into this. I felt like I had something special to give to this story, and I'm in love with it, and that's what I'm working on now when I'm not out talking about the president's wife.
Awesome. That's so fun with the Easter eggs that you're putting in about Dayton. And I'm so glad you're in love with your next project, because I think you can really tell when someone was like, I'm going to phone this one in. Completely side note, but is there any connection between her name Catherine and the like place where the first flight was, Kitty Hawk? Is that a nickname?
No, Kitty Hawk was already.
Okay. It was already Kitty Hawk. See, I know nothing about it. I'll learn about it when your book comes out.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's a really fascinating story, and okay, this is a little scary. How many men we have in here? This is the first time I'm writing in a male point of view. Ooh. So let me know if I've passed or failed that test. My previous 2 novels were written in the protagonist, a female's point of view. But in this story, there were so many things that Catherine couldn't have been at. She historically wasn't at Kitty Hawk to see the amazing moments. She didn't see a lot of these things happen because guess who was home working? and supporting the family. Catherine. So, and I didn't want to do that. Well, he comes home and explains it to her, and I thought it'd be much more fun to have it in Orville and Wilbur's voices, because they are quite interesting characters. I learned a lot about them as well, and it was really fun to get into that male head and talk from their point of view.
Are you writing their points of view in first person or third person?
All first person.
Oh, okay.
I
wish you luck,
I like that
my friend.
closeness. I just, first person. Now here's my struggle with the book. I've never had this struggle before.
Okay.
As I'm writing, especially for some reason, Orville's point of view, he kept wanting to be in the present. I don't know if it was the first time getting writing. Why did these men just wanted to be in the present point of view, which is
it's urgent.
It's also kind of difficult to write, especially like a long format. A short story you can do it, but I beat those boys back. I got them into past tense, but I'll have to say, and probably most readers won't even notice this. You have to be kind of a writer to even notice. There is a point in the novel, it turns, I let Orville and Catherine has to change to present tense. So it did, and it was appropriate. Then I knew why. At that time, I know why this is written in present tense.
Yeah, not for nothing, one thing I love to do if my text doesn't feel urgent enough or pacey enough is I'll write it in present tense and then go back and retcon it, jerry-rig it into a past tense. It just helps.
It's a battle.
Yeah, it is a struggle. It is a struggle. And, my hat's off to you for doing a male voice in first person. We've talked about male voices just now. It's like, okay, how do I get back to this question? What do you feel is the direction of women's fiction today? That's often a readership that appeals. Sorry, I lost the sentence. It got away from me. Your books are the sort that often appeal to a women's fiction readership. What do you feel is the direction that women's fiction is taking today? Is it changing from what it's been in the last 10 years?
I think what we think of as women's fiction is changing, and I can give you what the Women's Fiction Writers Association believes is the definition of women's fiction, because it's not what you think. We think women's fiction, well, that's novels and stuff that women like to read, and that's not their definition whatsoever. Their definition is it's an emotional journey. The protagonist doesn't even need to be a woman. It could be a man. But women's fiction is, according to this association's description, it's about the emotional journey. Yes, you might have a love story. It may or may not be historical, but that we have to see that progress. And can be romantic, maybe not. Doesn't have to have, in a romance, has to have a happily ever after or happy for now ending. Doesn't have any of those rules. So I think there's a name change coming, and I think that's probably will be the best thing for women's fiction, because men like to read emotional journey stories too. Almost all, much of your literary fiction falls under sort of a category of emotional journeys, and some of that would also be considered women's fiction. So I think they have a nomenclature problem. They really need to change that. Now, I don't know what the new name should be, but that's what I predict.
I really like that prediction. I feel like it's been a long, slow change because, 20, 30 years ago, you could get away with calling it chick lit, which, how, And now
don't call women's fiction authors that they're writing chick lit. Oh, yeah. Boy.
And then women's fiction takes half of the population and says, hey, this isn't for you.
Right.
When men love character-driven stories just as much as women do. So I love that prediction. I hope it comes true. I think Gabriella is telling us it's time to open up for audience questions.
You catch on real well, Jessica.
This is not my first rodeo.
My way in, but she's right. We are going to open it up to audience questions. But first of all, thank you, Tracey and Jessica, for such a wonderful conversation thus far. So we're going to open it up to our Zoom audience and our in-person audience for all your written questions. So if you're in here, you have the clipboards. There are pens. If you need a new pen, just I'll get you to just shoot me a furtive look, and I'll get to you. But just go ahead, write your questions. Me and a volunteer will go ahead and collect them all, just pass them down the aisle, and we'll pass them along to Jessica. We do have some people that got ahead on our Zoom, so I'm gonna go ahead and pass these off first, and I'll let you get started.
Okay, let's see what we've got. Give me 1 second. This is a multi-part question. Okay. Research seems to be a big part of finding your characters and the writing about the time period and historical events in which your books take place. What is your research process, and what do you think makes for successful historical research?
Oh, I love that question. Well, I have a pretty distinct process that I follow. And the very first stage is discovering, who's my protagonist. Once I have that settled, then I take several months, depending on what my deadline is, to do nothing but research. I don't really write a word. I don't even write myself Post-it notes. I am really just researching, and generally, as possible, traveling to the settings that I have chosen for the novel, generally where most of the novel will take place. So it's traveling, learning, just feeling the environment and the settings where my book is going to take place. And that whole process takes usually at least 6 months, and I haven't even written a word. But it's just irreplaceable time. After that, I pretty much write an outline, and I know, what the scenes are going to be. I've kind of decided, okay, this needs to happen, and this is a good place for that to happen, or where it did happen in history. And I have a nice outline of scenes. Nothing's really been written yet. But then after that, I start writing according to those scenes, generally in the order that they're going to appear in the novel, which is, in my novel, it's generally chronological, but there's exceptions. So I start writing, I think in scenes. It's, maybe I watch too many movies, I don't know. But that's how I don't write a scene until I can kind of sit back and see it happening. And I start hearing the dialogue. And as I'm creating this character, I'm kind of hearing how they talk, and you want your characters to sound different. You only got words on a page, right? But they have to have their own voices. And so I start kind of, getting an idea of what is the language they use. Some of that is historical, a lot of that I have to fill in, and some of the characters are completely fictional, and I have to make all that up. But generally, when I'm making up a character from scratch, it's somebody I've met or a collection of people I've met in real life. So I like to say, be nice to me, because you might just show up in one of my novels.
I've seen that on a sweatshirt, and I'm like, I need that sweatshirt. Or on a tote bag, and I'm like, I'm a writer, I already have too many tote bags.
Yeah, that's right. You're going to be in there somewhere. Yeah. But then the final step is, so I'm writing my scenes, and I'm putting it together, and you're making those transitions. For each one of those scenes, I need to now go back and do more in-depth, specific research. I like to use the example of the opening of The Engineer's Wife, my book about Emily Roebling and the Brooklyn Bridge. It opens with a military ball in 1864, okay? So I need to know what type of dresses were they wearing, what shoes were they wearing, how was the hair, what was the music of the era, what were the popular dances. You have to, as a historical fiction writer, the expectation of the reader, at least me as a reader, is that you get those details right, because it's one of the things we love about historical fiction, that we're learning about the era. Yeah, characters could be fictional or not, but the era is true. The details are true. And those are the things that immerse us, at least me, into a story. So I'm doing the research pretty much throughout the process.
Very cool. I love the immersive part where you're just letting it gestate the ideas. Sorry, I think research is probably one of my favorite parts about the whole process. This is a very important question, and I don't think that I could have asked it better myself, so I want to give this priority. The questioner disclaims at the start, I have not yet read the book, but how did you handle the issue of Woodrow Wilson's racism? What do current authors need to do in approaching such issues that were not so divisive then, but are now? And perhaps to get us started, for people like me who aren't so familiar with this part of American history, could you explain what made his policies or whatever racist, and then how you handled the issue.
Or
Or
allegedly
his beliefs.
thought of racist now. It's a really, really important point. And Woodrow Wilson's history, Edith is rolling over in her grave because many of the things he did, his policies, are now thought of as racist. But the way I wrote it, and I didn't sugarcoat the things he did. I put it out there, I didn't judge. But what I tried to do is put it in the time frame of the time. You know, he made these decisions, but why did he, and sometimes it's well written why he made certain decisions. And I try to get the reader to see that these decisions kind of made sense, at least in his brain, during that time. He would have never thought of himself as a racist. I'm quite sure of that. But he did things like one of the more notorious things he did was in the previous administration, they had several blacks in the cabinet. I don't think they were actually, cabinet members, but, in the administration. And he allowed his cabinet to fire them. They all change out, and they change out, they put in their own people, right? So when they put in their own people, he didn't say, no, you can't, fire this person because they're black, purple, whatever, because of race. He didn't tell them they couldn't do that, so he's now accused now of being a racist. Like, we had blacks in the administration, and now we don't, and it's your fault. But in his mind, he's the executive. He picked the best, all men, for their positions that he could find. And he felt it wasn't his business to then pick their support workers, who they want. And then they chose people they knew, people from their own state, their own political, their own societal circles. And that's how he chose it. It wasn't an intentional, we don't want black people in administration. It wasn't that at all. And that's what was done at the time.
Okay. And do you have any thoughts on what current authors need to do in approaching such issues?
I think it's really important not to sugarcoat what was done, but to report it as much as you can within the framework of the time. Don't judge by today's values. They didn't go through all the things we went through. They are not coming from the same space. So try not to judge. Try to report it as it was. Try to report what their feelings were as much as possible. Sometimes you have to just sort of guess why they might have made this decision. Not to say that there weren't, flat out racists, then and now. I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying my characters, I don't believe, were. And I did talk about their, the very questionable sometimes policies.
Absolutely. Thank you for your answers on those two questions. If I can pivot to Edith for a little bit, what do you feel differentiated her from other, quote, strong first ladies? And then I like this follow-up question. What about the period we're living in, 2000 to present, makes writing about your choice of subjects easier or harder?
Well, I think Edith is very different because of her very strong involvement in everything that was going on in the administration. Probably, I think we all would agree Hillary Clinton was also very involved in the administration, but I think Edith was quite a few levels above that in her intimate day-to-day, pillow talk and knowing everything that was going on and physically doing some of these things, encoding and decoding messages. So I think Edith was much more involved, and a lot had to do with just how Woodrow worked than any other first lady to date. I think she's very much set apart there. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
The questioner was asking, what about the years 2000 to present, so like the last 20 to 25 years, makes writing about your choice of historical subjects harder or easier? Maybe a little bit of both?
I think part of both. One of the reasons I wrote this book now is not anything about the current administration. I really don't want to go there. I don't want a comparison. That wasn't my goal. My goal was that I believe that we're really on the cusp of having our first woman president. When it's going to happen, I'm not sure, but I think within an election cycle or two, I think we're going to have a long-awaited woman as president, and I champion that. But I also worry. I worry that a woman who is not ready, not fit, not experienced enough, that will be chosen for her pretty blonde hair, her pretty red hair, her attractive figure, the great way she wears a dress, all kinds of other things, which are really sexist things. What her political party is, who is supporting her, what state she came from, and whether, and not on the really, really important things. Being an executive, being president does not mean you do everything. Being president means you find the best people to do the right thing, and then keep an eye on it and have a goal and have everybody. It's a leadership position. It's much like being a CEO. So I have this fear that we'll finally get our first woman president, and she's going to fail because she's not picked for the right reasons. So I kind of looked at this story, at Edith's story, as sort of a cautionary tale. Like, here's someone who wasn't even elected, but stepped into the presidency, and yes, she knew a lot about what's going on, but still, she wasn't prepared in decision-making and many other things that she should have been, and she was taking over a role based on what she thought Woodrow would want, and wasn't able to adapt to the situations. That whole failure then led, in my opinion, to the failure of the League of Nations and the failure of the United States to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Those two things, I don't claim to be a historian, but just as an American knowing a little bit of history, those two things, I think, were quite instrumental to leading to World War II. And that was my cautionary tale. Pick the right people, not people who happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right color hair and the right sex.
Right. And also, just to add to that, when it's a sample size of one, when you have had precisely one female president, it's not just, we're comparing her to how other presidents have run things. We're comparing her, as I think I can say we've historically seen with other sample sizes, we're comparing her to herself and going, all women would be bad at this job, which is not true, and potentially isn't even true in her case. You mentioned, and I want to use this question to tie into something you just said. This questioner asks, you said Edith did not advise presidents and that was a good thing. Why a good thing? If I'm understanding correctly, it's because, she was not really the executive. She helped other members of future cabinets understand their role, but you think it's a good thing that she didn't advise other presidents the way Eleanor Roosevelt did?
Correct. And she basically says in her own autobiography called My Memoir that she pretty much disclaims that she acted as president in any way. I just sort of told him, I told him what was important to look at and what wasn't important he didn't see. But that wasn't acting, and I knew what he would want, so I would just went ahead with what he went, and I was really just sort of a steward. So I think in her later years, even though she mostly worked at his legacy and his name and his legacy, I think she studiously avoided being in that role, because I think she probably got some scuttlebutt about your acting president. I'm sure she did. It was in the papers. Madam President, some people call her. So I think she very studiously avoided giving advice to subsequent presidents. To her own husband, absolutely, that was a daily, if not hourly thing. But subsequent presidents, no. She advised women and other people in the surrounding, but not the people in power.
Gosh, I'm just sitting here thinking, thought experiment-wise, it's such a slippery slope, because if you're so used to being able to come home from work at the end of the day, sit at the dinner table and say, hey, how was your day? But all of a sudden, one partner has, the highest security level in the land, if you aren't ready to go, hey, I can't talk about that, you say one little thing about what the ambassador to France said that irked you, and all of a sudden it's like, well, what if you say that to him? And then, so.
But I think being in a military family and also family member in the diplomat corps and being a nurse, it's actually not that hard. It is drummed into you. I could sit down with my husband and he could tell me the things he could tell me, and there was a wall, and it was just instinctual. He knew where that wall was. He never told me anything that was above my security clearance, which was 0. None at all. And I never told him anything that was health administration. I couldn't mention names or things, and it was very natural. And I think that's kind of used as an excuse. But no, really, professionals, this is their profession. They know how to do it. It isn't hard. It's instinctual.
So compartmentalized. Yeah. Okay. No excuses, Woodrow Wilson.
No. But maybe they didn't, again, looking back at how did they think it at the time.
I mean, at this point, we didn't even have like a secret service. We didn't have half of the alphabet soup of Washington, D.C. There was a lot less bureaucracy and the compartmentalization that goes along with it.
Yeah, they did have secret service.
They did.
That started with Lincoln.
Apologies. This is why I write contemporary fiction. We talked about the more enjoyable parts of writing this book earlier in our conversation, but I and this reader want to know what was the hardest part of writing The President's Wife. And then they have a little parenthetical I want to share. They say, I haven't read this book, but now would love to read it.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think the hardest part was writing Woodrow's decline. Because I was, I was half in love with the man too, even though, I just had how he changed from my vision of who he was and what I thought he was and some of the bad things he did and the failures, and just kind of getting inside his head and reading his love letters and really just sort of falling in love with his ideals and who he was, and then having to, basically kill him, that was because I get really close to my characters, and hopefully maybe it comes out in the book, but maybe not too much. You don't want to be maudlin. At the same time, you want readers to feel. I want my every one of my books, I want my readers to both laugh and cry, and that's kind of that's my measurement. Did you laugh and did you cry? Because I want all parts of the spectrum of emotions in my book. That's, I read to feel, and I write that way too, I hope.
That's another little Venn diagram of us, the laugh and cry. And there was a very late moment where I cried. I won't give it away, but I did.
Did you laugh?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Success.
Check. I think I'm just going to close with this question I like to ask, because I know that Jacksonville Public Library has a very devoted readership, and then, of course, so many readers are also writers. So for any aspiring authors who are in the audience or in the Zoom audience or watching this months from now, what is the piece of advice you wish you had had when you were starting out that you know now?
Well, something I did, right? Follow your dream. Write the book that only you can write. I chose things that I felt I had something special to bring to the story, something in my experience or background. So write the book of your dreams. But don't be afraid to send that book out to people, lots of people, especially if it's your first book, because what you think is just the most grandest thing on earth, and I'm guilty, that this is just amazing, looks very different in other people's eyes. You may think you're explaining something great, and it's not clicking at all. So get yourself into a writer's group, meet with some people, read their work, read the work of other writers who are about in the same stage, or even better, who are a little bit ahead of you. You will learn a lot from reading other works in progress. So share your work, get it out there to as many eyes as you can. As you go along, you'll need that process less. I know I do, because I actually have a whole lot of voices in my head. I'll write something and I'll hear Mary Jane saying, no, don't write it that way, it's confusing, blah, blah, blah. We haven't been a nurse or whatever. So you'll get a lot of those voices in your head, but it's really critical in the early stages to form a group, a relationship, online, in person, however you want to do it, and read other work and have them read yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.